At the international level, the most important thing is that every country offer a target that is proportional to their contribution to the problem, and that they do everything they can to meet their target. At the international level, it's very difficult, because how do you make another country meet their target? You can peer pressure them, you can shame them, you can impose border tariffs or fines. Ultimately, you could go to war if you could. But at the international level, it is very difficult to enforce the targets. And so each country's individual responsibility is to propose a target for themselves that is commensurate with their contribution and to ensure that they do meet that target. At the national scale, the most important thing, I think, is to institute an economy-wide signal on carbon. Right now, our carbon is subsidized to the tune of about 6% of the world's GDP. In other words, we are using something that incurs costs to ourselves, but we can't experience that cost ourselves. So in Ireland, in my home country of Canada, and many other countries, we already have a price on carbon. And most economists agree that that is the most effective way to start to reduce our emissions across the entire economy. Because just as we are all part of the problem, in the same way we can all be part of the solution. I'm very inspired by the action that universities are taking. First of all, in taking responsibility for their own carbon footprint, for tapping the innovations of many of their researchers who study alternative energy or efficiency technologies, and then for integrating climate education across the curriculum. So often we think of climate change as an issue for the physical sciences or the life sciences only. But the reality is that we need to study climate change from every aspect. We need to understand the psychology of climate change, the sociology, the human geography, the way that we talk and communicate about climate change. It affects us in all areas, and so integrating it across the educational spectrum is essential. At the community level, there are two very important things for us to do. First of all, we have to adapt and build resilience to the changes that we can no longer avoid, whether those include flooding or water shortages, extreme heat in the summer, increases in energy demand, increases in insurance rates. We have to prepare for these changes, and our communities are the most important place to start to do that. We also need to reduce our carbon footprint as a community as well, with issues like public transportation, the sources of our energy and our electricity, and other issues. And then we need to have a community-wide conversation about it. Because one of the most important things that binds us together is our sense of place. We all live in the same place. We want that place to be able to provide a safe home for us, a stable economy, jobs, the resources that we need. And so having a conversation that focuses on what matters to us, what we value the most, what is the most essential part of our identity, being from this place, and what we can do to preserve those things is so important. The reality is that the majority of our carbon emissions are produced by industry, especially the big industries that produce fossil fuels, as well as the big manufacturing and industrial companies too. So industry has to play a key role in envisioning a carbon-free future and in taking significant and meaningful steps towards that. Let me give you a few examples from across the spectrum. I serve on the Scientific Advisory Committee for ENGIE. They are aiming to be the first multinational energy company that is carbon-free. So they are constantly exploring new ways to provide energy that do not involve carbon. Then there's BP. I was in the airport a few years ago, and the woman checking in beside me was speaking to the BA agent. And the BA agent said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I work for BP." And the agent said, "What is BP?" And she said, "Well, it used to be called British Petroleum, but they changed the name. And now BP has a carbon neutral goal for 2050. I'm not sure how they'll do it, but they've at least announced a goal so that they will no longer be a petroleum company, they will be an energy company in the future. Microsoft recently announced that they plan to reduce their emissions to zero, and they plan to draw down all of their emissions back to the 1970s. So they will have been carbon neutral basically since they began. And then we have big corporations like Walmart that are reducing their own carbon footprint, but they're also trying to remove carbon from the global supply chain as well. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we have companies who say, oh, we support a price on carbon, but the amount of money that they spend on promoting climate action is just a fraction of the amount of money that they spend on organizations that attack climate action and that attack climate scientists. So when we look at industry, we have an entire spectrum from pioneers who are leading the way to some of the biggest and richest corporations in the world who are dragging their feet at the end. When I first started talking to climate change about people, the biggest question I would get is, what am I supposed to do about it? And I thought, well, I'm a scientist. I tell people that we have a problem, but I'm not a solutions expert. So I had to sit down and think about it. Because when we're talking about one of the greatest, if not the greatest challenges to face our civilization at this time, telling people to change a light bulb and eat less meat doesn't quite seem at the right scale to fix the problem, does it? And it isn't. Now, that's not to say those are not important actions. Efficiency is a huge way to reduce our carbon footprint through using smarter appliances and better light bulbs. Eating lower down the food chain is a great way to reduce our carbon footprint. So is traveling less. So is making smart decisions in every part of our life, from the clothes that we buy to the place that we live. But individually, even if every single one of us did everything we could, it would not be enough to fix the problem. We need system-wide change. And that's why the single most important thing that I think anybody can do about climate change is talk about it. Use our voices to advocate for change. And in talking about it, talk about what we're doing ourselves, absolutely. Talk about what our university is doing, what our city is doing, what our county and our country are doing. But use our voice to advocate for that system-wide change, because that's how we're going to fix this thing. So in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, we can step on the carbon scales, a carbon footprint calculator, and we can figure out where the biggest part of our footprint comes from. When I did that, I was surprised. I thought that it would either come from driving or maybe from my diet, but it wasn't. It was flying to scientific conferences and meetings. That was the biggest part of my carbon footprint. So I thought to myself, I can't be a climate scientist and not do something about this. So I decided that I was going to start trying to do virtual talks and see how it went. We actually did an experiment with students, where students came to attend one of my talks, and we put them either into a room where they saw me talking live in person, or a room where they only saw me talking on video, pre-recorded. And we tested them before and after to see if there was a difference in their response and their acceptance of climate change and the importance of climate action. It turned out there was no difference. So that's when I started doing more online talks, and now about 80% of my talks are online talks. Often people will ask me to speak, and I'll say, well, I would like to give you a virtual talk, and they'll say, well, we've never done that before. But I say, please try. And so it's usually been very successful. So for example, I'm speaking today in Cork, but I'm also speaking in Carson City, Nevada, and I'm doing that virtually. When I do travel, what I do is I bundle my talks. So I don't fly to one place anymore to give one talk. I will only fly now when I have, for example, at least 10 events to do in the same place. And here I'm actually doing 18 talks and almost 40 events in 11 days. So the average carbon footprint of my trip, I've calculated, is as if I took my little hybrid and I drove, maybe an hour and a half from my home to give a talk. So bundling those talks is a lot of work. But it's a very important way to reduce my carbon footprint while still connecting with people and doing the single most important thing that I feel I have done about climate change, and that is talking about it. Talking about it makes a huge difference. The social science has showed that when we talk about climate change, and the best people to talk about it are us, friends and family. So friends and family are the best messengers, and when we talk about climate change, we actually begin a true positive feedback. Because the more we talk about it, the more we know. The more we know, the more concerned we are. The more concerned we are, the more we talk about it. And it initiates this positive feedback where we then talk about the need for action, we support the need for action, and that is what leads us to system-wide change.